Good morning, everybody. I can see lots of people joining us as I speak. My name's Lewis Purser. I work at the Irish Universities Association here in Dublin. It's a rather damp morning here in Dublin, but I hope the week is starting well for all of you, wherever you are. And thank you very much for joining us this morning. I know many of you joined us 10 days ago on the 7th of September, and we had a technical issue, and you were very patient, but the webinar actually didn't take place on the 7th of September, despite our best efforts. So we're hosting it again this morning, and delighted that so many can join again. Thank you for your patience, and I hope it's worth your while. I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Jakub Grodecki is the Policy and Project Manager at EURASHE. EURASHE is the European Association for the Institutions in Higher Education. Jakub works on topics linked with the European higher education area, including quality assurance. And previously, Jakub served as Vice President of the European Students' Union. Our second speaker this morning is Cecilia Biaggi. Cecilia is Policy and Project Officer at the European University Association and has been working on quality assurance for over a year and is responsible for the QAfit project at the EUA. As you know, this is the first of a series of webinars about the QAfit project, Quality Assurance Fit for the Future. The QAfit project is led by ENQA in partnership with EQUAR, the ESU, EUA, EURASHE, and a number of national organizations, including IUA, which is why I'm here. And it has a couple of main goals: to map the state of play of quality assurance in the European higher education area, to explore how the European standards and guidelines for QA in higher education have been used by actors at different levels, and to critically evaluate the fitness for purpose of the European standards and guidelines and the eventual need to extend their scope. One of the first important steps of the project was to survey or to conduct a number of surveys on different stakeholder groups. And this webinar looks at the QAfit survey for higher education institutions. There were 260 valid responses. And as you can see here, mostly just over 2/3 of them were universities. Universities of applied science came next with about 20%, and then other higher education institutions. And a very large proportion of them are members of a European alliance. Almost all countries were covered, but the response rates were rather uneven, and a number of important countries that were very, very low or no responses. So while the survey is an important input to the project and for consideration, it's not the final word. But we're delighted to present to you this morning the outcomes of that survey, and Cecilia and EURASHE and Jakub will do that. Next slide, please. So the other surveys that took place and are being completed as we talk are the QA. This is this morning's webinar. So Cecilia will present the survey about the survey results upon internal quality assurance. Jakub will look at survey results for external quality assurance, and then we'll talk about the possible revisions and next steps for the revision of the ESG, and that section of the discussion will be led by Cecilia. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. There's a number of ways to engage with the seminar this morning. Many of you are using the chat now just to say hello and to say good morning. But there is a Q&A which will be monitored. And if you have substantive questions, please use the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. I hope you can see it. And those will be monitored, and those will be the ones that we'll pick up for the Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on now and pass the floor to Cecilia, who will present the results of the survey about internal quality assurance. Cecilia, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Luis. And thank you to everyone joining us today. I'd like to start with some good news about internal quality assurance, although I realize that such news are probably not a surprise for people working in the sector. we confirmed through the QAfit survey that existing QA processes are overall in line with the expectations of the ESG. For example, internal quality assurance is now addressed in some way with virtually all responding institutions, in line with ESG standard 1.1, which says that institutions should have a policy for quality assurance that is made public and forms part of their strategic management. It is, in fact, one of the key principles of quality assurance in the European higher education area that institutions have a primary responsibility for the quality and for quality assurance of their education provision. We also have data from around 15 years ago showing that already at the time, the majority of higher education institutions in the European higher education area did address QA in some way, either through one or multiple documents. But the percentage has increased since then, so I think that we should be happy to see that some progress has been made and that there is a positive trend here. And not only almost all higher education institutions have some form of QA statement today, but we also found that institutions seem to design their internal QA with a comprehensive approach towards their activities, as you can see from the graph here. As you know, the ESG focus on learning and teaching, but we see here that generally internal QA covers all the three stated missions of higher education in the European higher education area, which are learning and teaching, research, and service to society. But internal QA processes also go beyond that to cover things such as academic freedom and institutional autonomy. This is, of course, due to national QA agencies requiring institutions to do so in their respective countries. Now, in most countries of the European higher education area, the national criteria for internal QA of higher education institutions have been evaluated as being in line with the ESG. But obviously, national agencies do not just apply the ESG, they go beyond that to cover many aspects of institutional activity. We can also see from the graph that coverage of the various aspects is not complete and it is not uniform. But our analysis does not show any clear geographical trend here. So I think it can be said that internal QA plays an important role for higher education institutions and for most respondents, establishing an internal quality assurance system has had a positive impact on their institution. Now, in general, it is to be remembered that those who responded to our survey are QA managers or equivalent. So to some extent, it is to be expected that they would positively judge the impact of internal QA. Nevertheless, we did gather enough data to confirm this. And as you can see here, there are also a good number of concrete examples of the benefits of the implementation of internal QA. Respondents pointed out that the implementation of an internal QA system has allowed them to collect feedback more efficiently, that internal QA has improved decision-making and cooperation between stakeholders. In a few cases, internal QA has facilitated preparation for national accreditation processes, and some respondents also mentioned its positive impact on transparency, on the exchange of good practices, and on the achievement of their institution's strategic goals. Now, to conclude this session about internal quality assurance, I'd like to talk a bit about how higher education institutions see the future of their internal QA systems and about what they plan to change. The majority of our survey respondents do expect some changes in their institutional QA processes and strategies in the next few years. For example, a good number of respondents stated that they will work to improve processes to collect feedback, but also how they use the feedback that they receive. It seems that digitalization will play a big role in the revision of QA processes, and respondents expect this to have a positive impact on different activities, also to foster innovation in teaching and to help verify learning outcomes. Those few respondents who declared that at the moment their internal QA system does not cover research plan to extend their QA processes to this area of activity, while others plan to include internships, micro-credentials, online education tools, etc. In the next few years, according to our survey respondents, internal QA will expand its scope and positively impact different aspects of higher education, ranging from institutional governance to internationalization. The analysis of the data collected suggests that the majority of respondents do see the implementation of internal QA as a continuous improvement cycle serving both accountability and enhancement, as it is prescribed by the ESG. Now, as I already mentioned, survey respondents are generally QA managers or equivalent, so their level of engagement in internal quality assurance is obviously high. According to our data, academic staff, administrative staff, students, and external stakeholders are all engaged in internal quality assurance. But some respondents definitely see room for improvement here. In the future, our respondents would like to facilitate processes and improve opportunities for all stakeholders to engage in internal quality assurance. For example, by proposing shorter questionnaires, improving the visibility of QA processes, and providing better information about the use of the feedback collected. There's also, in a minority of cases, the need for what I would call a change in mentality. Some respondents lamented that academic staff is sometimes poorly interested in QA and that they see these processes as just bureaucratic exercises. And sometimes it is difficult to collect feedback from students. So overall, these issues seem to affect only a minority of respondents, but nonetheless, I think they may indicate that more work is to be done in terms of stakeholders' engagement in quality assurance, in internal quality assurance. Thank you. Now I give the floor back to Luis.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Interesting findings coming through and some useful pointers from different parts of Europe about what people are doing internally. There's a number of questions beginning to pop up on the Q&A. They will be moderated as they come through. And please, if you have any questions in your mind that you'd like to raise with Cecilia, pop them on the Q&A and we will come to them at the Q&A session at the end. You can see the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. And it seems to be working. Thanks again, Cecilia. Jakub, we'll move over to you now.
Thank you very much, Luis, and Cecilia. I will pick up from here. We have just heard a part of the survey results regarding the internal quality assurance from the eyes of higher education institutions. Now let's jump to the external quality assurance based on the part 2, obviously, of the ESGs, and add some key observations from higher education institutions there. As a general observation from what we've seen, most of higher education institutions understand the role and appreciate the existence also of this external quality assurance process. Those external eyes are a core external mechanism that assesses and ensures the functioning and even existence of the internal procedures at the institutional level. So with this background check, let's say this double check is appreciated from the institutions. Part 2 of the ESGs covers the aspects pertaining to external QA and the framework in which EQA should address its contents through the review processes. So higher education institutions have a general understanding of its scope and role and functioning of those processes. However, there are apparent differences in certain aspects of EQA and the role of the agencies, depending on the culture and the system in the respective countries. As Europe we exist in has a very diverse context in European higher education area, the perception and even the rigidness of the procedures and how the approach is being conducted from external views differs from country to country. Another differentiating factor is actually the maturity of the quality assurance systems, which has to be recognized, and thus how external quality assurance systems are organized in the countries. Those realities can be reflected in the general orientation towards standards and guidelines that might differ within the different countries, and the notion of accountability versus enhancement in the local context. Now let's jump to the answers that are the results of the summed up part of the block part regarding the ESG part 2 questions. So on the next slide, one of the opinions we've asked higher education institutions is their point of view on external quality assurance procedures and whether they agree, slightly agree, or disagree with the sentences. So higher education institutions view the 3 most agreeable points. The highest percentage of the agreement was about the role of the external quality assurance in developing a quality culture, the enhancement role of the quality assurance, and the provision of a public accountability. On the other side, however, of the responses, we observe a hesitance towards the statements that external quality assurance is adapting quickly to education system changes, and that external quality assurance does not encourage innovation and experimentation in higher education. So those would be potential challenges to make quality assurance more responsive to the general education and the system needs and its adaptation to the future developments. Regarding the next slide, in the latter part, we have asked if certain external quality assurance areas, in the opinion of higher education institutions, are covered by the external quality assurance, and if yes, to what degree. The top options were the participation of students and staff in higher education governance. So already here we can see a major developments comparing to the previous revision of the ESGs, which is quite exciting differentiation with the general stakeholders' involvement, because other stakeholders, such as the labor market representatives or the societal actors, are in the below or at the middle of the stake. So from additional comments, it was linked to the fact that the time availability and awareness of external quality assurance processes outside of the institutions is way lower in comparison to the internal stakeholders in the academia. Secondly, and quite natural answer, I will not elaborate on that, was about the quality of education provision being covered. Of course, learning and teaching and education provision is the key aspect of the current framework. And the thirdly, institutional management. The interesting observation here is that the same area was highlighted as the one which the institutions do not want to be assessed directly. So the question to dive in more towards the end of the project is whether this institutional management is understood as a autonomous management of the institution, or rather the management of the processes which external quality assurance tackle. The topics the institutions believe they have covered to some extent or not yet at all are the topics regarding the online learning provision, the lifelong learning aspect of education and provision, and the social dimension of education. So those 3 big lots have been mentioned as not yet directly or to some extent addressed by the external quality assurance. And not yet in the procedures as well. We were talking about the quality assurance of the recent developments which gained attention of the past years, such as European alliances or micro-credentials, which are being tested or tried in the national systems or the institutional one, but not yet in the framework. I think the reason are quite straightforward. When it comes to the next slide, you can find also quotes and observations. As you heard, we've received more than 260 responses, so there was also a chunk of descriptive answers that we have grouped. We tried to group them and make them sum up the questions that we have received. And those were indicative in the few directions. For example, when it comes to the potential avenues of the GSG development, or at least drawing the attention to some initial conclusions. Part of them is the general remark I've been mentioning at the beginning, that QA system is fulfilling the general role of being an external eye for institutional reality. In most cases, the external perspective is leading to an evaluation that can guide the institution in implementing their mission and further developing their day-to-day work. A bit of the other notion is that external quality assurance processes were generally enhancement-oriented and well-organized, but they're also demanding from the institutions. So the demand aspect of the quality assurance procedures were mentioned, and being to some extent bureaucratic and rigid and overwhelming for the staff. When it comes to the next one, the European Quality Assurance Framework may be too unified and does not recognize the specific needs of the different type of the institutions. There were some comments that the general framework of the ESGs is so broad that some of the institutions of the different types might find hardship in translating this general framework to their institutional context, for example, when it comes to the applied science universities, online universities, etc. The next one is a perception on the EQA depends highly on the maturity of the systems within the institutions. What I mean here, what we've observed is that there is a different attitude towards external quality assurance depending on how supportive, for example, the procedures within the quality assurance agency in a certain country are. In the countries where the enhancement approach is more visible, we've seen more, let's say, good approach towards what the role and the support coming from the agencies and the panel, for example, panel reviews is. And last but not least, the EQA frameworks need to consider innovation and new developments. It has been repetitively mentioned in a various contexts, either when it comes to the micro-credentials, the development of the alliances, or any other cooperation, international cooperation in transnational education in Europe. So on the next slide, last but not least, we have asked a general question about the purposes of external quality assurance, which might give some hints of the revision directions. And additionally, respondents pointed out other objectives of the external quality assurance beyond the graph you see on the screen. So some of them are the further implementation of the Bologna tools, so the quality assurance framework serving as a support for implementing of already existing tools such as diploma supplement, ECTS systems, and supporting the larger purpose of facilitating international transparency and the cooperation between higher education institutions. The other one was mentioned that any upcoming quality assurance framework must emphasize cross-border quality assurance approaches between universities which are collaborating internationally. The next one is notion that accountability must remain minimal, limited to building trust among students, the public, and the higher education system, and supporting students and staff mobility in Europe. And the last, let's say, group of notion was the general concern regarding the over-standardization when the autonomy of higher education institutions and academic freedom must remain the core part of it. So not for sake of standardization to limit the academic freedom and the autonomy of the institutions and keep the quality approaches below this main parts. So that would be summed up the notions and the general understanding of the external and the role of external quality assurance from the perspective of higher education institutions. And I'm handing back now to Cecilia to sum up the both external and internal quality assurance and how the potential ESG's development might grow.
Thanks very much, Jakub. Just before we hand back to Cecilia, some really interesting points you've raised there coming out of the institutional survey on the perceptions and practices in external quality assurance. There's quite a few questions coming through now on the Q&A. So please look at those. You can vote for them, and indeed many of you are already, to see which ones you'd like answered on a priority way. And then if you have your own questions, particularly if you've been stimulated by some of Jakub's presentation just now, please pop them in the Q&A as well, and I'm sure the speakers will get to them. Cecilia, we're going to go back to you as Jakub promised. Can you talk to us a little bit about potential or possible methodologies and steps for revising the ESG coming out of the project?
Yes, thank you very much, Luis and Jakub. Well, I would start by saying that our respondents generally have a positive perception of the ESG. They find that the ESG currently provide adequate guidance in both external and internal quality assurance. That ESG encourage trust between institutions at the European level, and that they support a common understanding of quality assurance. So in other words, according to higher education institutions, ESG are serving their purpose. But respondents also would like to see some changes in the future. Now here I would like to point out that questions about the ESG in the survey registered higher numbers of blanks and I don't know answers in comparison with other questions. This is likely due to the fact that our respondents do not always have detailed knowledge of the ESG. They are academic and administrative staff in higher education institutions who normally follow national legislation and other specific and sectoral regulatory frameworks. Nevertheless, I think it is possible to draw some preliminary conclusions about what changes higher education institutions would like to see. For example, there are various topics that survey respondents would like to have included in the ESG in the future. They are particularly keen on lifelong learning and digitalization of learning and teaching, but I would say that there is also interest in having the other two missions of QA, so research and third mission, included. But also the social dimension of higher education and environmental sustainability are topics that many in higher education institutions would like to be covered by the ESG. It is to be noted, however, that although a majority of respondents would like to see these topics covered by the ESG, at least to some extent, there are also significant minorities, which are around normally 20% of the respondents, that do not want these topics covered by the ESG. And there are also areas of activity that higher education institutions are reluctant to have included in the ESG, particularly institutional management and institutional autonomy. So certainly there is not complete agreement among higher education institutions about a potential expansion of the scope of the ESG, but we can identify some general trends. And also the fact that respondents would like to widen the scope of the ESG clearly indicates that they believe that the ESG are still very much needed. And in fact, our data shows that respondents oppose the idea of reducing the ESG to a few core standards without accompanying guidelines. At this point, I should inform you that the results from all QAfit surveys about the revision of the ESG will be discussed in a paper that will be published soon, and that will consider the points of view of higher education institutions, students, QA agencies, and ministries of the European higher education area. So today we are not going to spend too much time comparing our results with those of the other project partners. But we can anticipate, as you can see here in the slide, that all stakeholders agree on the importance of a European QA framework, and that they do believe that the ESG are important to support the development of learning and teaching, trusting qualifications, student mobility, as well as quality culture. In general, we can say that all stakeholders would like the ESG to provide more guidance, and that there is agreement on the need to revise the ESG. Although I would say that probably higher education institutions are a bit more cautious than other stakeholders. The inclusion of research and third mission in the ESG is generally seen quite positively, as well as the inclusion of other aspects of academic activity, although there are differences in the level of agreement. For example, everyone agreed that fundamental values should be evaluated through QA, but students seem to be very keen, while QA agencies and higher education institutions are less so. As already mentioned, institutional management and institutional autonomy are not something that our survey respondents would be enthusiastic to see covered by the ESG, although the majority of ministries and QA agencies disagree. In any case, higher education institutions have pointed out that any future change in the ESG should not add to the workload of academic and administrative staff. In fact, a good number of respondents to our survey have pointed out that the implementation of internal QA systems increased their workload because procedures were complex and time-consuming. A few respondents even stated that the costs of internal QA exceed its benefits due to the inadequacy of human and financial resources. So it was suggested that the adjustment of national regulations to meet the ESG requirements should have decreased other bureaucratic demands in order to ensure the sustainability of the system. So I think that this is something that should be kept in mind when the time comes to revise the ESG. This is all from me now. Thank you, and back to Luis.
Excellent. Thank you, Cecilia. And some very interesting findings coming out there, and particularly the slightly different perspectives of different stakeholder groups. I'm sure these will be picked up further, as you say, in the analyses of the surveys on the other stakeholder groups that have been done as part of the project by different project partners. And we can talk about that in a minute. Excellent. Any more Q questions? Please pop them in the chat. There's quite a number coming through now, and we'll get to them in a moment. So thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, Jakub, for the outlining what we're finding from the institutional survey around internal and external QA so far. Can we talk a little bit about next steps of the project and where this particular strand of project activity will join up with the other strands that are underway?
Yes, definitely. So a brief mention from my side on this, just for everybody here, and we have nearly 300 of us here, which is a great number. We are, let's say, pre-middle of the project on QAfit right now. So we have drafted the survey, we finished the survey right now, and now we are in the moment of having a clear conclusions from the different perspectives from the four stakeholders. And this is one of the series of the webinars that will be conducted also by the other partners. So first of all, at this moment, if you are interested in the other results but not yet compared with each other, you can clearly go to the QAfit website or the website of other E4 organizations and see whether there is a session planned on the other stakeholders there. So we will have a session coming from ENQA regarding the quality assurance agencies. We will have a series of, we will have a webinar also from the European Students' Union on the students' perception, and one organized by ECAR on the responses from the ministries. Then the next step is also to dive more deep into the analysis, and each of the project partners will organize the focus groups, which will more particularly address the needs of the certain groups the organizations are representing. For example, at least saying on behalf of EURASHE, we are planning to have a focus groups on this topic soon next month in Cyprus within the quality assurance community of practice. So, and that would be mostly focused on the applied science universities. So if there is anybody from applied science universities, there is still a few spaces there to join. Regarding other focus groups, I'm not sure when they are planned, but the window for this is from now towards, let's say, 2 months. I think that would be optimistic. Assumption. So the focus groups will happening as a direct communication and direct meetings with the certain groups of stakeholders. Then also in the parallel, we are aiming to publish 2 papers, one regarding the internationalization of quality assurance, and second regarding the future cross-cutting paper on the future of the ESGs. And those are the 2 papers that then are jointly written by all of the stakeholders, and that might be more indicative towards comparison of the different results. And then we will go into the final conference, towards the final conference in the mid of the next year, the final conference of the project, when we will be again trying to, of course, inviting all of you who would be interested, trying to compare all what we have what we have gathered. And the reason, of course, not the reason, but the basis will be built on that, and that's a good basis to actually drive this decision further. And then up to the countries, up to the also realities that is happening within the Bologna process, because obviously we are now building the stakeholder point of view on the quality assurance, what is the perception by the different ones. That basis is strong foundation to be taken on for the further discussion and even start the discussion about the revision. So as you are aware of the existence of the Bologna process, the upcoming ministerial conference is taking place in Tirana in Albania, and potentially the project will give us a basis to carry on with this topic and then confront this with the perception from the countries and find up the responsibility and the mandate towards the revision in the upcoming years. So those are the next steps of the timeline. We are now in the post-research, let's say, phase. We are more in the dissemination phase, and we will be going towards the end of the project in the middle next year. But politically, as a process of a revision, will only start and be kicked off, mandated by the Bologna process, if any, and in the way as we will agree over this time in upcoming months next year.
Thank you, Jakub. Very interesting, and yeah, setting out steps for the project, but indeed beyond the legitimacy of the project and into and hopefully feeding into considerations of the Bologna process and the follow-up group and all the other structures that are there. Thank you. There's lots of questions coming through, and Jakub, you began to answer. There's two questions, particularly about the survey method and what comes next. So I don't think you explicitly said there would be a transversal study of all the QAfit surveys, but you implied that as part of the bringing together the collective analysis, I'm assuming there will be. There's a question around the second question in the list is specifically around a transversal study. Will there be do you think a short report published on that?
Go on, Cecilia.
Sorry. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there will be this paper specifically focusing on the potential revision of the ESG from all the points of view of all the stakeholders involved, and another similar paper on the topic of internationalization. We don't have a date for the publication of these papers yet, but they will be published before the end of the year, for sure. And they will bring together the results that we've had so far from all the surveys implemented. But then there will be another publication towards the end of the project that will consider all the points of view, but not just the results of the surveys, but also what we will find out through the focus group that Jakub has described. Because the surveys for us were meant mainly to give us a broad picture of the state of the art of quality assurance in the European higher education area, and also to point us towards some aspects, some topics that we would like to study more in depth through the focus groups. So all of this will be brought together towards the end of the project, and the publication will consider all the points of view involved.
Thank you, Cecilia. And can I take it? We've also answered there was another question in the Q&A around avoiding a sampling bias. I'm just looking at the methodological questions now. Obviously, the responses to the surveys are what they are, but you're moving beyond that through the use of focus groups with particular constituencies. Jakub, you mentioned that.
I'm sorry, which question are you referring to?
It's the second one on the list now, to avoid additional mechanisms to avoid the sampling bias in administering a voluntary survey. Obviously, the survey itself is complete at this stage and can't be revisited, but there are other steps in the process you mentioned, such as focus groups, which will try and avoid that self-selection bias.
Yes, sorry. Now I see the question because it disappeared for me for a second. Yes, indeed. We first of all we launched the request for filling up the surveys to all of members of EURASHE and the EUA and those who can contribute in the respective groups. So of course we were not having much of an impact. We advised in the request to make the survey be filled by those who are managing the quality assurance processes within the institutions, and from that on we already taken that as a starting point, and we were not being able to monitor therefore who is filling up the survey and combat this, let's say, this bias. But exactly the focus groups that are further now on will more in detail dive into the results that we have now and work and compare them with the actual point of view, with the people in the room, with the groups we will be working out physically with stakeholders in the respective groups. So that's the methodology we taken. We were quite optimistic to have many more answers than 260, although it was also quite complex survey in that case. So also we are not that pessimistic about the numbers of answers we had. Maybe when it comes to the geographical distribution, that was our core issue there.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks very much. There's one question that's garnered a lot of votes at the top of the Q&A list, and I think it's worthwhile a little bit of discussion now. I suppose the primary roles of internal quality assurance against external quality assurance, and the compliance versus self-enhancement functions of these. Any reflections on this particular provocative question posed by Lucien Bollard? I think if you may allow me, I think there's I'm struck by the data coming through the survey responses and as published in the report, that the order of responses in terms of significant impacts, in terms of to a large extent, to some extent, not at all, in the areas covered by internal QA very much resemble the same areas covered by external QA. If we look at the list from top to bottom, they're very much grouped in the same way, and I would have expected some to see a little bit larger differences, I have to say, particularly in some of the more emerging areas like lifelong learning, micro-credentials, online learning and teaching, service to society, online student assessment methods. These still appear to be relatively little or poorly integrated in internal quality assurance and not, but likewise external. And I just wondered to the extent that external quality assurance requirements and methodologies are dominating and driving the internal ones as opposed to the other way around. Any reflections, Cecilia or Jakub?
Well, I would say that in terms of internal quality assurance, we found definitely that compliance is still important, but there is a move towards an enhancement, which is expected. Yes, not only in terms of internal quality assurance, but also external quality assurance. And my impression is that universities make a lot of effort to go through these processes, and they tend to see them as something that they are required to do, that they have to do it, so it's sort of a formality, but given the effort and the costs involved, they tend to expect more than just compliance and to look at them as opportunities for enhancement. I don't know if Jakub agrees, but this is also something that we found out in terms of external quality assurance, that these revisions are seen as opportunities to self-reflect and to bring about some enhancement. So there is definitely a lot of interest in that from higher education institutions.
It is definitely, however, from my own thoughts, because as you're saying, that the opinions are varying, and I think that's very strongly correlated with the maturity of those systems. That is the basic on this question, because everything is fine when the procedures are in place within the institution, and this is just a double check of their existence, and it's also a very comfortable situation for the external quality assurance to focus on enhancement, on the proposals for the future, something to be considered, something to be added, or even to raise up the topics that may be not in place. However, the baseline in some cases might not be reached. So we also have to think about some backup mechanism to allow also for the enhancement in this realities where the basic standards are not being met. So how to organize this in the country context where, for example, all the quality assurance processes are being funded within the same framework, and to differentiate that between the maturity of the different institutions, but also from the side of external, I think it's a big challenge to do. I'm not saying that I do not believe yet that we are in the place when we can unify this framework as a only enhancement oriented and to not put the base requirements in the European scale. But we definitely have to go into valuing the systems which are more developed and, for example, have been gone through few cycles of positive assessment of the umbrella actors that are there for the quality assurance agencies. That's a challenge, how to phrase it, how to make it work, to not create a double standards, but still keep the two missions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's an interesting pair of questions coming through about European cooperation, one around the QA of joint study programs, and another one around a role for the ESG in the context of European university alliances. If maybe we would address those two together. The question around the QA of joint study programs is, why is this still taking so long? We've been talking about it for a very long time, and I would agree we have been talking about it for a very long time. And I suppose the follow-up to that is, what's the role, if any, for the ESG and for the European University Alliances, and how can we learn from, I suppose, the difficulties we've had of using QA for joint programs running between institutions across different QA systems to make sure it doesn't take another 10 years for QA to work properly in the European University Alliances. Cecilia, would you like to take this up?
Well, I think that in terms of alliances, as we saw, most of our respondents are members of alliances, which I think is very significant data, because I think it shows that members of alliances are interested in QA, and they feel like more is needed in terms of regulations and QA regulations for alliances. Now, I don't know if Jakub agrees, but we have been looking a bit at alliances with our survey and at what may be needed. We found that most institutions that are members of alliances do evaluate the alliance itself, but it's we have very different opinions in terms of if the QA should evaluate the alliance, if the national QA is sufficient to evaluate the single institutions, so there is no need for an evaluation of the alliance in itself. So I would say that the data we have is not really conclusive in this sense, if we talk about what higher education institutions really want.
Yes.
Thank you, Cecilia. Jakub?
When it comes to the question regarding alliances that I just seen on the screen, they are flying a bit one by one, and they're changing. So when it comes to the alliances, it's still very important to build up on the current discussion. I've seen the comment on the unique pilot project. There are another pilots that are happening right now, and we also cannot ignore the fact that very many of the universities are obviously in the alliances, but also in the international corporations that are outside from the alliances. And indeed, the tool of the European approach is there. And how it's utilized and how popular it is another question. So combining this approach that we already are existing with some idea how the joint programs, joint degrees could be assured. It's basing still on this developing of the trust between the agencies, but also in the framework it should be definitely a matter of further discussion, because we clearly see that from the discussions, from the debate. So I'm very looking forward to also the outcomes of the pilots, in the sense of the either the legal basis for the joint degrees or the European degree notion there, because that will also determine what the existing systems can do, not even within those initiatives, but as the whole initiatives are being also understood as a one that are determining innovations in the system. I think it's definitely a topic we cannot ignore there. There was also the second question, I think, from Alexander. I've seen that there is also a fear that we might end up putting everything into SGs and driving using ESGs as implementing anything what arrives. I think that's indeed linked to the previous one, that if there is a certain mission that institutions want to go with, and it's clearly defined as their main mission, their targets, their orientation, either towards mobility, towards internationalization, we might have institutions that do not have the same missions and the same ambitions, let's say. So I think the subject of assessment should be very heavily based on the mission that is defined by institutions themselves, and then match it with the core standards that are subject to the whole European agreement. But definitely recognizing the specific mission, and which is even more specific when we think about the alliances, will be something that the quality assurance will be challenged to do, and that's linked also with the general notion about flexibility of the framework that will be required, and this is required from the institutions in the future. I think that's my thoughts on this two questions here.
Yeah, thank you, Jakub. And I think this useful comment underlines maybe the potential for greater differentiation between internal quality assurance, which is what institutions want to do, and to make sure that they are maintaining and enhancing and improving quality of their own activities, and then they can really focus there on their own priorities, as opposed to the external QA and maybe at a European meta level what comes through in the ESG. I was surprised, as I said earlier, to see such a very significant similarity between the internal and external areas covered. And I think maybe this is where we could have greater differentiation, and where institutions could respond by developing maybe more nuanced, more differentiated internal quality assurance based on their own missions, their own strategies, their own priorities, as long as they continue to obviously meet the national and European standards and guidelines. Cecilia, any comments on that, or we pass on to another question?
I think we can move to another question, because we have so many and there is not so much time left.
Yeah, very good. Very good. There's an important question here that's coming through around diversity and maturity, and wondering whether we should whether ESG Part 1, and I know this is straying a long way from what was covered in the HEI survey, but whether it should be turned again into principles, and the standard could be reviewed through somewhat differently. Any reflections on this?
I would say that this is a valid suggestion, and a revision of the ESG may consider not just the content, but also the structure of the ESG. So at this stage, it's definitely too early to give a final answer on this. But I think there is definitely a need to provide guidance. So it will not just be a few core standards or principles without some practical guidance. But I would anticipate that although no one is going for a revolution, let's say, but there may be some substantial changes to the structure of the ESG in the future after the revision. So this is definitely something that we will consider when the time comes.
Thank you. Jakub, there's a question here around beyond the data that you've actually shown us. I wonder, was there anything in the report which, if you analyze things by different types of institutions or different countries, whether there was a greater diversity between different types of internal quality assurance than have appeared in the overall aggregate findings, or is it very much the same picture across the entire European higher education area? I wonder, do you have that granularity of data to respond to this question?
Unfortunately, we struggled a bit with analysis in the way that we had the data from some of the countries were coming in a plenty, let's say, and some countries were very, very singular. So at the end we find a hard challenge to differentiate these approaches, because that would lead that, for example, from one country we would have just one or two responses, whether in other we could do a really case study about the whole country perception. The problem, of course, was there a bit of a time constraint and the resources we had in that, and it didn't allow us to look more than a global perception here. We rather looked on the comparison between the common questions between the stakeholders, which refers to the previous question on whether that will be study on this. So we compared the results from at least the common questions, because the survey was designed in a way that there was a set of the common questions that was same for all four stakeholders or for groups of stakeholders, and then the specific ones there. So we compared more the data in this area rather than the granular one by one data or country by country in the separate questions here. So that's the fact beyond it.
I would quickly add that we did try to see if there was any striking differentiation, for example, at geographical level or in terms of type of institution, and nothing particularly striking came up. So, which doesn't mean that there is absolute uniformity in terms of approaches to internal QA, but I would say there are some general trends that we found pretty much all over the European higher education area, such as, for example, the important role of the university leadership in implementing internal QA, which seems in most cases to be to have quite a centralized approach. Although there are some exceptions, I mean, there are some institutions that have a more decentralized approach. So there are faculties and departments with their own QA unit. But overall, it seems that it's more the leadership of the university that plays a very important role in this. Also, in terms of stakeholders' engagement, we found that overall all stakeholders are engaged, although external stakeholders are less engaged than others. But this is something that we are going to look more into through the focus group, because it's one thing to tick the box, but yes, students are involved, for example, but we didn't ask specific questions about the numbers of students, the responses to feedback surveys, and so on. So, as I said, the survey was very useful to give us some direction of topics and aspects that we want to investigate further, but it did not give us all the answers, of course. So today we wanted to sort of present the general picture that we got, and to highlight some areas that we will investigate further in the next future.
Perfect. Thank you, Cecilia. Steps forward. We're approaching the end of our webinar. Just a minute or two left. Thank you very much to everybody for your attention and your contributions through the Q&A. I hope we've answered most of them. I don't see any more questions coming up, but there's Cecilia and Jakub. There's the last few questions that we haven't really addressed there. You've 30 seconds if you'd like to pick up any of them.
Can try.
And while you're thinking which ones, if any, you'd like to pick up, I'm delighted to say that just last week, so it's the bonus from having postponed our seminar from the 7th of September, but the ECWA have now published their analysis of the survey responses by the ministries, and that's available as well if you look online. So QAfit, ministry survey responses, ECWA, you'll find it. I don't have the exact link to give you at the moment, I'm afraid. But that will make very useful reading in tandem with the document on the higher education institution survey responses. Cecilia, Jakub, last words or any final answers?
I would like to remind people, if Julia can show the slide, that we will have the European Quality Assurance Forum, ECAF, taking place in Portugal at the end of November this year. The theme is internationalization in a changing world, new trends and challenges for QA. And of course, we will also be talking about the revision of the ESG. We will have a parallel plenary session on this, but I think many will touch upon this theme all across the event. So registrations are still open. You can find it on the EUA web page. So I invite all of you to check the program and to register for this event.
Thank you. Jakub, any final words? Otherwise, it's time for us to wrap up now.
Yeah, I think it's a small farewell, and thanks for attending here. I'm just seeing a couple of questions there, which in 30 seconds I think it cannot be addressed. But when it comes to the timeline and the question from Lucien, when it comes to inserting different items and the discussion on what and how the ESG revision would look, I think we are indeed not maybe in the 5-year timeline. We are actually not certain about the timeline coming from the BFUG, simply because it's a discussion which might happen there, and it's not certain how and what kind of a mandate yet will be given. But if that would be decided, then I think the strong basis coming from this project will already be a step forward, and then the whole work and the debate within the framework in the group will take place. So I would be quite optimistic when it comes to the length of a timeline in putting and understanding what really is still needed. But we just hope to give some sort of basis at the start. So that would be it. When it comes to the metaverse, which dragged my attention, I think that's exactly what flexibility gives the approach of defining your own mission and your own innovations. In that case, of course, none of the quality assurance system will assess the metaverse capability of the faculty to use these technologies and so on, but rather only can value this as a according to institutional mission and using of those technologies. But the quality assurance framework is just a reflective tool, in my opinion. So I'm sure that kind of activities, which will be novelties, will be valued around. That would be all from me. Thank you for attending.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think it's time for everybody to go. Maybe a cup of coffee or on to your next task for the day. But thank you so much to everybody for attending. Thank you to Cecilia and Jakub for very stimulating presentations. Thank you to EUA in the background for organizing the seminar. And thankfully, we didn't have any technical difficulties this morning. Thank you so much for all your support. See you again soon. You can follow the QAfit project on various social media tags, #QAfit, and keep in touch. Thank you.